their family and being told that it's just anxiety and that they need to calm down and go see a therapist.
Welcome to Lost Girl Therapy. So I am stitching this video because I absolutely love this creator. This video is the absolute perfect encapsulation of what happens when you have POTS and when you get dismissed. In my experience, it took over 2.5 years to get a diagnosis, and in the over 20 doctors that I saw in that time, almost every single one told me that I was simply anxious. And despite the fact that I had explained to them that I am a licensed therapist and my job is literally to work with anxiety and understand how it works, and despite the fact that I have a very high awareness of how anxious responses manifest for me, both physically and mentally, I was written off. And every single doctor would basically say, like, you look healthy. Everything looks fine. Your scans are fine. Your imaging is fine. Your blood work's fine. Everything is totally normal. And yet I felt horrible. And the thing about POTS that was incredibly difficult to navigate was this sense of feeling alone. And basically that feeling of just being written off. And it wasn't until I saw a cardiologist who actually listened to me and listened to my entire story arc that I was able to kind of be pointed in the direction of POTS. And I was very lucky that she took the time to listen to me, because typically with the POTS diagnosis, it's not clear cut. For me, especially, it showed up as like kind of blips on a radar that would happen where I would have like escalations, and then I would just be like somewhat fine, but always kind of feeling off. And then I would have a whole different set of symptoms, and then they would go away. And this kind of went on for the better part of like 2 years. And the only reason that my cardiologist caught it is because I had seen her 3 months before, after ending up in the ER for a very severe episode. I had had the sensation of being like, I am going to faint, on the verge of passing out, followed by uncontrollable shaking. And the shaking went on for over like 3 hours. And that's why I went to the ER. And I remember the attendee in the ER basically saying, like, we can't help you. Everything looks totally normal. We don't know why this is going on. Go home. And she actually sent me for a neuropsych eval, which is a souped up version of therapy where you go get your cognitive abilities evaluated as well as your like emotional standpoint at that time. And I remember being so frustrated and like almost offended, because I love neuropsych evals. I think they serve an amazing time and place. But when you're in the throes of like a physical episode, the last thing that you want is for someone to tell you like, hey, you're basically just making this up and we're concerned about your mental status, so we're going to send you here instead. And for me, what ended up happening is that I scheduled an appointment with my cardiologist, and I basically was like, listen, this is what's going on. I know that it sounds wild, but I'm not making this up. I am having these episodes where I have these waves of like a fear response come on. My heart rate will spike. My palms will get sweaty. I will have like intense, just kind of like difficulty breathing. I feel like I can't swallow. And I don't feel anxious. I'm afraid of flying. I know what an anxiety attack feels like. My mind goes wild when I am in a scenario that actually makes me feel anxious. But in a POTS episode, what was happening to me is that my body was having all these physical responses and my mind was not. My mind was basically in this state of saying like, hey, don't really know what's up. Not really sure why we're doing this. What's going on? And that's how I began to decipher between like, is this physical manifestations or am I anxious? Because this whole time I knew I wasn't anxious, but I needed to prove to doctors that I wasn't. And that is that frustration. That is that sense of being like, are you kidding me? Like, I'm coming here to ask for help. I'm coming here to get some understanding of why my body is having all of these random reactions that I've never had in my life. But I also have to prove to you and double down that I am like mentally clear and that I know what I'm talking about. So in the course of my diagnosis, I ended up having to see like upwards of 20 doctors. And when I finally did get the diagnosis, the specialist who did diagnose me said, you basically need to track your symptoms in a way that makes sense to doctors, not in a way that makes sense to you. And again, I was in this space of like utter frustration. Like, are you kidding me? Like, at this point, I had been doing all of the work myself. I basically figured out how to get myself to a point of like stabilization, how to like add salt to my diet or wear compression stockings or figure out like when I felt really good or when I felt like shit and like what it feels like to navigate my day to day. And for me to be asked to then take all of those symptoms and need to lay it out and explain it to somebody else so I could make sense to them just felt like the icing on the frustration cake. And yet, when I did that, I actually became easier to read for other people. And don't get me wrong, I hated every minute of doing it, and I still find it incredibly frustrating, but it was a game changer in how I speak to doctors. And that's mainly because when I talk about my symptoms and how they escalate, what I'm able to do now is I can determine how they escalate, the order that they show up, and I can also tell doctors what parts of my body systems are being impacted. So I can say these are neurological. These are the symptoms that have to do with my heart. These are the symptoms that have to do with like my blood sugar. And I can tell the difference. And that's why when I talk about awareness, it is critical. Having awareness for how your body works, how your mental load works, how you present to yourself is the number one thing that changed how I handle this situation. Because the first year and a half of this, I basically went to every doctor saying, can you please tell me what's wrong? In the second half of this journey, I showed up in doctors' offices saying, this is what's happening. I'm not looking for you to tell me what it is. I know what it is. I know how it shows up, and I'm looking for an answer as to how to ease the symptoms, not for you to tell me where they came from or for you to write it off. And when I started doing that, the way that I operated in the world changed. And it was mainly because when you fight POTS, it wins. It is something that deeply affects your nervous system. So if you are like trying to fight tooth and nail with your own physical responses, the only thing that happens for me at least is when I ignore my kind of like blips on the radar responses, if I just dismiss them and I say, oh, I think I'm going to be fine, I'm not going to be fine. I had an episode 2 weeks ago where I literally ignored all of my responses because I wanted to go and do something. And I ended up being like down for the count for basically 5 days of needing to be in bed. But even before that, I had a very intense episode of feeling like I was going to faint for about an hour and a half, followed by uncontrollable shaking for another hour. By the end of it, it felt like I had ran a marathon and my body was exhausted. And the really important part about that episode was that my family got to witness it. So they were actually able to see what happens when I say, hey, this is going on. This is what I mean when I feel like my heart rate is through the roof. This is what it means when I say I feel like I'm shaking uncontrollably. And it's because I look objectively healthy. But POTS is something that you can't really see and you just can't always quite explain, but your body's kind of always doing things and you have to be on alert. You have to be in awareness. So for me, I am constantly in this state of keeping track of what is going on. Even as I'm talking to you right now, I am very conscious of the fact that like the front of my shins feels cold, which for me is my first signal. That is the first thing where I'm like, is this going to escalate or is it not? I'm very aware that I can feel tension in my chest, but I also know that the tension is not from a POTS episode. It's because I'm talking about something that very deeply impacts me and also aggravates me a lot of the time. I am stitching with this video and I'm sharing this information mainly because if you are somebody who is struggling to get a diagnosis, or if you are somebody who has symptoms of POTS and you feel like you're alone, I want you to know that you're not. This is something that is incredibly challenging. It is so frustrating, and it is honestly so annoying to get taken seriously, but you don't have to do this alone. POTS is something that is often misdiagnosed or underdiagnosed or dismissed in women specifically because we get written off as being anxious. So if you are somebody who is struggling in this space, I invite you to check out the creator who I stitched the video from. You're also welcome to check out Lost Girl Therapy. Like, I'm very passionate about this, A, because I've lived it, and B, because I don't think that we are getting enough attention in this area when it comes to dysautonomia and how it is deeply affecting people's day-to-day. If you guys have any questions or you want to leave me a comment, I invite you to do so. This is a topic that I could talk about for days. So if you want to hear about how I kind of like uncovered it, what my symptoms were, how I navigate in my day-to-day, let me know.